Hi, welcome everybody, and welcome to today's Study Center event. Thank you for joining us. Our guest today is Vanessa Sasson. She is a professor of religious studies in the liberal arts department of Marianopolis College in Quebec, Canada, where she began teaching in 1999. She is the author of several academic books, but however, a few years ago, she tried something new and converted her research into a novel entitled Yasodhara and the Buddha, which tells the story of the Buddha from the perspective of his wife. Last year, she also published The Gathering, a story of the First Buddhist Women, which is the focus of today's talk. So welcome, Vanessa, and thank you for joining us today. I wanted to get started by asking you what motivated you to write this story?
Um, so my motivation for writing this book in part is that I had started the process with the Yasodhara book, and then I just haven't been able to stop writing this way. So I'm actually on my third kind of academic novel. I'm not quite sure what to call these books. They're either called hagiographic fiction or I call them academic novels, but they're basically my research converted into something much more accessible that becomes a story. And the reason why I do that, there's like a million reasons. So how would you like me to approach this question? Because I could say a lot about this. I'm wondering if you have anything more directed, because I could talk about that alone for about an hour. Or are you just trying to get me to get started? Is that what
Yeah,
you're
I was just trying to get you started.
I mean, if I jump into the why of it, it gets really complicated fast. There's a piece of me that uh, is a little bit political in the sense that I think there's an importance of academics. I think scholars have to start writing more accessibly. This is something I've been thinking about a lot in the last few years. And so part of my answer to the question is that I think with all the education that we get as scholars, we have to start finding ways to share our knowledge so that more people can engage with what it is that we're doing and that we're not just talking to each other. So there's a big part of it that has that kind of social justice-y feel to it of just, I feel like this is my responsibility, is to take my research and try to find ways to make it that other people can participate. Um, I also wrote the material just because I love the material and I was excited to write it. But so there's a lot of answers to that question, but I'll slow down and I'll let you ask another one and we'll kind of move our way slowly through this so that I don't say too much in too quick a way.
Gotcha. Well, maybe we can start off with, yeah, how did you research this book, and how did you navigate, sort of the historical and textual challenges in reconstructing the lives of these women?
Well, so can I ask a question? How
Certainly.
many people are familiar with the story? Like, how many people know this story of the first ordination of women? So I see one hand, two hands, three, and then the other people are just like, okay. So maybe what would be more helpful is that I tell the story so that
Certainly.
everybody can kind of catch up a little bit, and then we can see why I wrote this and what I was doing. Does that make a little bit more sense? Um, okay, great. See, it's so great to see your faces. Maggie, I like that thumbs up. So, the story of the first women is actually a really difficult story. The Buddha doesn't look amazing in it. It's a controversial story. It's a hard story. It's a story I've thought about for a very, very long time. It is a follow-up to his ordination, his renunciation, and Yashodhara's life story with him when he leaves the palace life. So I'm sure you guys all know the Buddha was a prince, and he leaves home in order to do this quest to find awakening, and he accomplishes it. And he leaves behind his palace, right? He leaves behind his family. He leaves behind Yashodhara, his wife. So that's what my first novel was telling the story of what it was like to be left behind by her husband, right? And so he becomes this kind of great character. He's the hero of the tradition, but as a husband, maybe not amazing. So he leaves her, and according to some texts, not all of them, he leaves her the day that she gives birth to their son. So it's a really devastating, it's a story that I have thought about for years, and is a story that I struggled for a long time with, is what do I do with a character that's a hero who leaves his wife the day that she gives birth? Right. And so and it's not, I'm not the only one to like wrestle with this story. People have been thinking about this for a very long time. And the feeling of loss that she was left with, right? That and there's stories of her suffering that are really very exquisite all over the Buddhist world where he leaves and then the tradition follows her for a while and tells the story of her sadness. And in Sri Lanka, her songs of sadness are sometimes used as liturgy for funerals, right? Because who better to know what it is to lose a loved one than her? Because he just abandons her and he leaves her in a palace filled with her in-laws. And if you know anything about Indian storytelling, you know the in-laws never do well. And so she's stuck. Now she has amazing in-laws, according, because this is like Buddhist storytelling, so everybody's fantastic. But she's still left with her in-laws alone in a palace. And then he comes back many years later. He starts building the Sangha. He starts building the community, and he comes back. And her son is now 8 years old. And as the story goes, he says, well, it's time for his inheritance. And so then he takes their son from her. And so she has loss all over again. So her story is really quite devastating. She experiences this loss, this stripping away of herself. She becomes a widow, according to the tradition, because when your husband becomes a renunciant is someone who gives up worldly concerns and pursuits. So he's become a renunciant. He's left the palace. He's left his marriage. He's basically socially dead, right? That's the tradition's understanding of it. And so she becomes a widow. And according to the literature, she wears white afterwards. So she has to give up her royal clothing, her jewels. So she loses everything. It's a very dramatic story. And when you start to think of it from her perspective, you realize how emotional this tradition can be, how tragic, how insightful, right? We're always kind of think of it on a pedestal, this like, oh, you renounce and you let go and everything's fine. But Buddhist storytelling is actually much more profound than that. And it wrestles with suffering. It doesn't just describe it from afar. And so I really, when I wrote the story of Yasodhara, I was really engaging in that emotional life of this narrative that has such a life throughout the tradition, and you find it everywhere. Afterwards, so the Buddha is now kind of floating in the forest. He's a hero. He's amazing. He's achieved awakening. And men hear about this, right? So before he takes his son, other men hear, oh, he has achieved this in the forest. And so what you get in the narrative is these stories of these men who will walk into the forest and say, can I join you? Can I achieve what you've achieved? And his answer is always yes. And he accepts all kinds of men. This is really very striking about the literature is he accepts. So you must know that one of the very famous stories of the tradition is Angulimala, who's a story of this serial killer who kills 100. It depends on the text that you read, because Buddhism gets more elaborate each time it reads another version of itself. And so it starts with 99, and then it's like 1,000, and then it's like he's killed 1,000,000 people. He just keeps, like every story, he kills more people. But he's killed lots and lots of people, and he's so brutal that every person he kills, he cuts off a finger and he makes a necklace out of the fingers of his dead victims. So this is a brutal character. And he eventually, well, the Buddha approaches him, he approaches him, like there's a bit of a back and forth in his story, but the Buddha's the one to make the approach. And then he asks, okay, I want to learn from you. And he says, come. And this is his answer over and over again, is whoever approaches him, he says, come. That's it. That's the whole process of joining the Buddha in the forest is, can I do it? Yes, come, right? That's it. Come sit with me, and then they can shave their heads and you can start learning the tradition. So he accepts somebody like Angulimala. He accepts kings that have blood on their hands. He accepts all kinds of men into his community. He even accepts his cousin, Devadatta, who's like the Judas of Buddhism. He's this like bad guy character who's always trying to kill the Buddha. And so he keeps trying to kill the Buddha. And yet the Buddha says, yes, come, you can practice with me. So everyone is welcome. And like low castes are welcome. And just this whole cacophony of men are welcome to come and sit with him in the forest. And I'm emphasizing this because of what's about to happen next. So we're good so far? So we have this community. I know I'm doing the teacher thing. I can't help myself. You don't have to like nod happily if you just want to space out. I totally get it. But I can't help myself from being this way. So he creates this community and all these men are with him in the forest. And then one day the women think to themselves, oh, there's a community of men out there who are practicing. He's achieved this amazing thing of awakening, however we want to define that. I think I want to do that too, which is really quite radical and fascinating that the women take this on for themselves. So that's something to reflect on, is that the women thought they could, that the women thought it was okay to ask. So already there, you have like really interesting women characters who are thinking, I think I'm going to ask this. So they're not so subservient as we tend to have in our imagination that they think, oh, this isn't for me, right? They're already quite interesting women that they think, oh, no, this is for me. Let's do that. And the story is that the one to have that first impulse is none other than his stepmother, Mahapajapati Gotami, which is a mouthful, I realize, and a lot of people have a hard time saying her name, but Mahapajapati Gotami, you get used to it after a while. She was the woman who raised the Buddha. And so the very famous story of her and her, she's Maya, his birth mother's sister. The king had married the two sisters, and Maya dies. And so Mahapajapati steps in and she raises the Buddha as her son from 7 days onward. So she's basically his mom. Like, she's never been anything other than his mom, really. He's never known his mom. And so she is his aunt and his stepmother and basically his mother for all intents and purposes. She stepped in and took over and cared for him all his life. And then she had to watch him leave. And so she's been through her own hardship. But once her husband dies and she's fulfilled all of her obligations and she's basically the queen just by title, but she has no obligations left to fulfill, she has this impulse and she thinks, oh, I think I want to achieve what he's achieved. And so she does this radical move. And according to the literature that we have in the Vinaya collections, which is like monastic writings, it says 500 women followed her. So she has this impulse. I think I want to go ask the Buddha if I can do this too. And then you have this like amazing, I have it in my head anyway, this amazing image in my head of this fantastic women's grapevine where like within like that night, everybody has found, like, you don't have a text thread, but it's basically that where everybody's just like, oh, she's going. And so everybody's going too. And so by the next morning, when she's ready to walk out, there are 500 women who are like, yeah, let's do this, which to me is already super emotional and inspiring, is that these women just thought, I want to do this. Let's do this. Let's go. And so they walk together. And so you don't have like this like single guy here and there. You have a mass movement, which has made me think that this is like your first women's march, right? Trump does not get to claim that one. Not that that was the first, but you know what I mean. And so you have this massive women's march. That's what I was thinking when I saw those women's marches in Washington, right? Is this massive women just going, yeah, I want this. And so they do. And they pour out of their houses and they walk behind the queen. And so she's still operating like the queen, right? Like she's still kind of heading a community, but now it's a community of women, which is wild in and of itself. Like, when have we ever seen anything quite like this? And she carries these women through the forest to this grove where the Buddha is sitting with his male monks. And she walks in, and again, the courage of this moment, right? The audacity, but also she's a queen. Who else to be audacious, right? And so the audacity of this woman to walk into a male world, present herself to the person who is basically her son. And she says, I'd like to ordain. It would be nice if the Buddha gave us permission. And she's very polite about it, right? She doesn't say, son, you owe me. She says, it would be well, Lord. I'm like giving you like the old translation, but that's kind of how it often gets read. It would be well, it would be nice if the Buddha, this great being that you have become, were to ordain us. And the Buddha does something super bizarre. He doesn't say yes, and he doesn't say no. He says, maybe don't ask me this question. It is the most evasive, most frustrating line, I think, in the entire canon. There's no worse line than that line because no one knows what it means. Everyone argues about it. There's a million theories as to what it means. But at the end of the day, we don't actually know what it means. And all the different versions of that passage, because we have multiple Vinayas, they're all pretty much evasive. So the wording is different in each one, but we're basically stuck each time. What does it mean? Why would he say it would be better if you did not ask me this question? So then she does something even more audacious. She's like, well, maybe the first time wasn't the right time. Maybe I have to ask multiple times, right? So maybe she's like foreseeing the Zen tradition that you have to knock on the door 3 times and wait in the rain and the sleet until finally somebody says yes to you. So she asks a second time. And the second time he says, I would prefer if you don't ask me this question. So now she's thinking, okay, I have to do the third time. Then he'll say yes. So she asks the third time. And he says, I would prefer if you didn't ask me this question. And that's it. That is the end of the negotiation, because that is 3 times. And so 3 times is the magic number. If you're ever in India and somebody offers you rice, they're only going to do it 3 times. The third no is the no, right? And so the third no, you have to step away. And so she got no 3 times. Or she got some kind of, I'm not enthusiastic about you asking me this question 3 times. What he meant and why he did that, no one knows. But we've been debating it for 2,000 years. Yeah. And so that's the end of that scene in the literature. And we're all kind of stuck. And he said yes to Angulimala. He said yes to bloody-handed kings. He said yes to his arch rival, his nemesis, Devadatta. But to her, he says, I'd prefer if you didn't ask me this question. How are we doing so far? Does anybody have any questions, or can I clarify anything? Do I just keep going? Rob, do I keep going?
Sure. I did actually have one quick question. Where does this fit into his teaching? Is it kind of early on, or is it later on in the middle?
Oh, in terms of his lifespan,
Yeah.
where are we? So there, like the lifespan, trying to track where in the story anything happens is really difficult, because we have so many versions of every text that there's always debate and nobody can agree to anything. So the most common answer to this is that it's somewhere between 6 to 8 years after his awakening, which means it would be about, no, it's about 6 years after his awakening is the most common answer. But Rahula is often said to be 8 when he's taken him away, and then it's 6 years after that. It depends. Depends on the text that you read. So it's not something that you can answer clearly, because it's like a funny line through the tradition. Anyone who gives you a clear answer to that is reading one specific text, but that's not how the tradition works. We have so many texts in Buddhism that we can't quite make sense of timelines most of the time. Does that make sense? It's a really difficult question to answer, but it's usually relatively early on in his teaching career. So we're not like 40 years in. The women do join up relatively early, within the first few years of him teaching. But exactly where, 6, 8, 10 is negotiable. A lot of people will say 6. I don't know if that's at all helpful. All right. Do we keep going with the story? Oh, yeah, I think I see a hand up. Yeah, Ava.
Vanessa, I read your first book and I've been tormented ever since. I know there are a million theories out there, but I really want to know, what do you think? How can a fully enlightened being not see the humanity of women? How is that possible? And everything else that he has taught and I have actually practiced have helped me tremendously. And I've had an eclectic path, so I've tried so many other things in addition to Buddhism, and the Buddhism is the one that actually helped.
Yeah.
So, what is your personal answer to that? Please help, because it's killing me.
I know it's really, really hard. Let me keep going with this story because it gets worse. And then your question will have even more urgency. I think your question, I don't know that I can help you with that question. I think that's a question that you want to ask somebody who is like a Buddhist teacher, not a scholar, because this is like a very personal, emotional question. I can tell you a bit of what I think. I don't know if it'll be helpful, but I think that is the question that these stories land us with, is that we have to wrestle with those questions. And I don't know if we'll ever get an easy answer to it. In some ways, that's the question that made me want to write these books, is because I'm bugged by these questions also. Like, how can a Buddha leave his wife and his newborn son? And how can a Buddha respond to the women this way? These are the questions that's why I wrote them. It's one of the reasons why I wrote them. Okay, so just to finish it, because it gets worse, and then we can go back to that question. He leaves. You know that the Buddha is like wandering from village to village, yeah? And so he doesn't stay in one place for very long. He has monasteries that are built for him by different kings, but he never stays in them too long, because you're not supposed to burden a community. And so he was staying in one grove, and now he was staying right outside of Kapilavastu, where he's from. And now he's going to walk to Vesali, which is another town, and he's going to set himself up there for a while. And then the community is going to move on to another place. So he leaves this grove and he leaves the women behind. He doesn't address them again. He doesn't talk to them. He doesn't say anything to them. He just leaves. And so the women are left having to decide how to handle the situation. And just to like show you how difficult this story is, the concept of renunciation in Indian history is such that when you make the choice to renounce, you are not supposed to undo that choice. So when the women left home, so I know that we probably have all interacted with monastics who have given up the robes, right? People often will become monks or nuns for a while, and then they eventually realize this is really difficult in the contemporary context. And many monastics have disrobed, especially in our in our time, and especially in the West. It's very hard to sustain. So we've had to find ways to absorb that reality and negotiate that reality and make space for it, for people to disrobe. But traditionally speaking, it's not something that you're supposed to undo, and you're certainly not supposed to undo it lightly. And there's like all these texts in Indian tradition that anyone who gives up the robes, right? Like these are Hindu texts, not Buddhist, but this informs the time where if you give up the robes or you break your vows, you'll be reborn as a worm in a rotting fish for 60,000 lifetimes, or like they get pretty intense about it. So the choice to renounce is something that you're supposed to take very seriously. It's not something that I'll do for a couple of years and then I'll do something else. And these women have ostensibly, now we don't know this for sure, but they have left their home. They are moving towards a life of renunciation. They are looking for a place where their renunciation can be practiced. And so they're kind of caught in this bizarre emptiness, this in-between space where they're no longer householders. They have chosen to walk out, but they are looking for a community to absorb them so that they can practice. And this is one of the paradoxes of Buddhism, is that we talk about the monastic life as a life of religious homelessness. You may have come across that term, right? Where you've given up owning a home, having a home, right? And you're going to just live within the community to whatever they offer you, but you don't have any control over it. And so it's a life of religious homelessness, but you still need a community to hold you, right? This is the trip about renunciation, is that you renounce this world, but you're not saying I'll just dangle in the middle of nothing. You belong somewhere. You're just not belonging in a home anymore. You're belonging to a community, to a monastery. It's not absolute independence, right? It's not that radical. These women have left home. They are looking for a community to absorb them so that they can practice in safety, with direction, with guidance, with teachers. He's rejected them for that. So now they're standing there without anywhere to go, which could sound like this is the ideal renunciation status, but it's not, because you can't practice that way, right? The tradition has always understood that community is central. So these women are standing there without a teacher, without a place to call their home, right? For them to be safe and to direct themselves. And so he has rejected them, but they can't go back. And so he has really made life very difficult for them. And he knows this. He must know this. So they're in limbo. They belong nowhere and to no one, and they cannot go back home. They cannot say, you know what, that was tougher than I thought. And so 5 minutes after leaving home, we're back. You can't do that. You walked out. You're not going back home, right? And that is something for us to appreciate, of like how intense this decision was, how courageous it was, because they really did leave home. They cannot go back. And he did not give them a place where they can land. So it's a very intense thing that he has done. And so they have to figure out what they're going to do with themselves. And they do something, again, audacious, is that they decide to go ask a fourth time, right? So I just told you that 3 is like your magical charm. The women have been told 3 times, don't ask this question. Then he leaves and they basically chase him down, which is wild. And so he goes to the next town and they show up right behind him. And so they are not taking no for an answer. They are breaking the glass ceiling. They are breaking what is the traditional understanding of what they're allowed to do in this situation. They are just pursuing him. And in my imagination, if he had said no in Vesali and gone to the next town, they would have followed him again until they got a yes. So when you start to think in those terms, you realize these women, even though they're not receiving a great response from the Buddha, and so they seem very disenfranchised, they're really quite powerful, and they're audacious, and they are determined. They are not walking away. They have nowhere else to go. They have nothing else to lose. They need an answer and they want it from him. And so they go to the next town and they show up at his door. And then this is the best part about this story, is that they stand at the gate and they wait. It's like the oldest women's trick in the book. It's like what I do with my son all the time, right? Like you just stare him down and you wait. You get what you need, right? So they stare the Buddha down. They're just standing there waiting. They don't bang on the door. They don't show up with like bows and arrows. They don't do anything dramatic or aggressive. They just, he has no choice. So now one of the monks comes out, and one of our favorite monks of the tradition, and nuns continue to adore this. There's all kinds of rituals associated with him, is this wonderful character called Ananda, who's the Buddha's attendant. And he takes such good care of the Buddha, and he's always next to the Buddha, and he loves the Buddha. He doesn't go to sleep until the Buddha is asleep. He wakes up before the Buddha wakes up. He's in charge of his schedule. He's in charge of who gets to see him and who doesn't. He circles the Buddha's hut every night to make sure nobody bothers him, right? So he gets very little sleep, the poor guy. He never understands what's going on in terms of the teachings because he's so busy worrying about the Buddha that he never gets the teachings. And so the Buddha gave him permission to ask as many questions as he wants because he's always like delayed. Everybody else is achieving awakening, and poor Ananda's like, but did you eat? Right? He's like a little Jewish mom, right? He's perpetually surrounding the Buddha and worrying about him, and therefore never quite achieves awakening, the poor guy. And so the Buddha dies, and nobody spends more time with the Buddha than Ananda, and the poor guy doesn't achieve awakening during the Buddha's lifetime. So he dies and he still doesn't get it because he's worried about him, right? So he's a really beloved character. He's a very sweet character. He does eventually achieve awakening, thankfully, but it's like delayed. And so Ananda, who has this just extraordinary, sweet, compelling character, sees the women. Everybody else is happy to ignore them, but he cannot handle the death stare. And so he sees all the women standing there and he rushes to them. And then we get a detail in the Vinaya that's really quite special, is he approaches, and the text says that he notices that their robes are dusty, their faces are tear-stained, and this is the clincher, their heads are shaved. But nobody told us their heads were shaved before or that they were wearing robes before, right? We just had the women go to ask the Buddhist. We don't know what they look like, and we don't think about what they look like. But all of a sudden in this scene, we're told their heads are shaved and their robes are dusty. So they're wearing robes and they shave their heads. So when did they do that exactly? Again, there's a lot of theories about this. There's a lot of grumblings and misgivings about what this little detail means, because it could seem as though he said sort of no, and they said we're shaving our heads anyway. Which then makes it that your first Buddhist nuns, your sacred women characters of the Buddhist tradition, may have acted in defiance of the Buddha himself. That is one interpretation. Many conservative readers don't like that interpretation. You can go about this whatever way is going to suit you as a reader, but you do have these women suddenly with their heads shaved. They may have had their heads shaved before and we didn't know it, but suddenly their heads are shaved. And I find that a very interesting detail to and obviously me as a reader is very excited about the possibility that they defied the Buddha, which just makes them even more heroic in my imagination. But I could get in trouble for that. So their heads are shaved, they're crying, their robes are dusty. This is a queen who has arrived with all these women. We don't know who these women are. And Ananda, the sweet little Ananda, is like, what are you doing here? And the queen says, well, we've come to ask for ordination. And he's like, but he already said, no, I don't get what you're doing here. He says, let me go check. So then sweet little Ananda runs off and he goes to see the Buddha privately, and he negotiates just the two of them privately, right? So this is a part of it that's a little bit difficult for me as a reader of the literature, is that now the rest of the story is going to be a negotiation between men. I didn't quite accept that for my retelling of it. I found that a little bit difficult to stomach, but the first part I could accept. And so we have these two men talking to each other about what do we do with these women. And so Ananda asks the Buddha a really important question. He says, can women achieve, and this is a really important line in the literature. This line has been held onto by women all over the Buddhist world, is this line that's about to happen, is that he says to the Buddha, can women achieve awakening like men with the proper training? And the Buddha answers unequivocally, with the proper training, women like men can achieve awakening. Period. Non-negotiable. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. They're not, well, they can, but they need their next life. It's going to be sort of, but it's no. With the proper training, just like men, they can do it. Period. They are capable. So then Ananda makes a mistake, and he goes, well, so why is it that your stepmother over there, the one who raised you, who took care of you, then he tries to guilt the Buddha, which is a great moment. And there's been a lot of discussion about this. Like, did he just guilt the Buddha, right? The one who raised you and took care of you, why is she out there in dusty robes waiting for you to notice her? Like, don't you think you should pay attention? And so there's been debate amongst readers as to whether or not the Buddha finally said yes because he's been guilted into it. That's a really difficult reading, because then that means that every woman monastic is actually an embodiment of his guilt. And I think that's a terrible thing to do to monastic women. But there have been some scholars who've read it as that is his family duty to say yes because of that line. Other people have challenged it. So again, I'm giving you places where the tradition has space to like really wonder, what does all this mean? But he eventually says, okay, I will ordain these women. But then he gives them conditions, and this is one of the hardest parts of the story. He says, I will ordain the women, but they have to agree to 8 heavy rules. And these are the Garudhammas, which you may have heard about in different communities. And these are rules that still apply today. Each community, again, negotiates these rules differently. There's so many interpretations to everything in Buddhism. But the rules start with rule number 1, which is the heaviest. And it is that if a woman has been ordained 100 years and a man has been ordained 1 day, she is junior to him. And if you know anything about traditional Buddhist life, you'll know that hierarchies are really, really important. Where you sit, how you, the bowing, you bow lower to someone who's higher to you. Like, so everything is organized by age of ordination, hierarchies. It's not a democratic tradition, right? Democracy is not built into Buddhism. We may want it in there, but it's not part of it. And so everything is hierarchical, with the Buddha kind of flaming on top, right? Like he's this flaming fire. He's at the top of the hierarchy. And then we all position ourselves in different slots depending on our status, our training, our monasticism or not. And the tradition really does function that way. And so to tell women that your place on this hierarchical ladder is at the bottom is a very profound statement. So no matter who the men are, no matter what their attainments, no matter how long they've been around, they will always be above you. And then all the other rules are versions of the same thing, but in different circumstances. And she has to accept those in order to be ordained. And so she does. And that scene is really that her accepting these rules in order to be able to be ordained. That's a little bit of the punch to the stomach. And so when Ava asked that question of like, what do I do with this? It's not just, what do I do with a Buddha who leaves his wife and his newborn son? What do I do with a Buddha who's not enthusiastic about having women into the order? It's also, what do I do with a Buddha whose story says that he instituted a ladder and put them at the bottom? It's really very, very challenging material. So I will stop the storytelling there. And now we can negotiate this and discuss it in whatever way suits you best. But it's really very tough material. So to answer Rob's question, part of the reason I wrote these books the way I have is because I want my material to be accessible. I also wanted to play a bit more, which sometimes in academia, I don't always feel super playful. And part of it, I did these particular stories because these are the stories that upset me the most. So I go where I'm challenged, and these stories challenge me. And I don't know if I can make them better, to be perfectly honest.
I wonder if we know how accurate these writings are, because they will have been written by men.
So this is one of the places where people go to kind of solve the problem. Is, oh, well, so this is all written about 500 years after the Buddha may have lived, right? We can't determine any of this stuff historically, right? That's why I talk about them as stories, and I will never talk about them as history. The books that I write, I call hagiographical fiction, not historical fiction, because I don't know that any of this is actually history. These are the stories the tradition has that they have been passing on for generations. So I'm taking them seriously as stories because these are the stories we have. And so I'm not editing out something like those rules because that's the story that we have passed on. But did the Buddha actually say this? I don't know. We can't know, right? We've got a 500-year gap between when we think the Buddha may have existed and when we start getting our first texts. And then the texts have a lot of discrepancies and changes to them. And they were certainly not written by the Buddha. You could argue, but there was an oral tradition and people were very strict about preserving oral traditions. And so it does go back to the Buddha because otherwise you demolish the notion of an oral tradition. I don't know what to do with any of that. So I steer clear of the question of history because I don't know that anyone's equipped. We don't even know if the Buddha himself existed. We have no material evidence that he existed. So all of this to me is a lineage of stories. And and in my mind, I have to respect them because they're the stories that we keep choosing to tell. Regardless of whether they're true, the Buddhist community has told these stories consistently. And so I don't know if the Buddha would have said this or not, but I know Buddhists have chosen this story over and over and over again, and therefore I have to wrestle with it, right? I have a friend who's a Buddhist nun who, while I was writing The Gathering, we met up on Zoom at one point to talk about the book and where I was going with it. And she said, well, you can't put the rules in. She was very upset with me. She was like, don't put the Garu Dharmas, don't put those 8 rules. You have to edit that out. And I said, well, I can't, what do you mean? I said, what do you mean I'm not going to put those rules in? And she said, but she made a really interesting point. She was like, we have been working so hard as Buddhist women to get over those rules. We are trying to change the culture that these rules dominate our lives. If you put them in, you're making them popular again. We're trying to undo that. You're going to remake it, which was a very valid argument. And she said, and we don't think a real Buddha would never say that. So let's just not put it in there. I was like, if I do that, I'm censoring the tradition and I'm making it look sweeter than it is. Like, I can't. That's the mess of the tradition. If anything, Buddhism is about mess. It's about suffering. Like, I can't clean it up for you, but I understand her concern, right? So these are really hard things, but I won't negotiate the question of history. I can't. That's the long and the short of it. Kemi?
Hi, thanks so much for the story, or for your telling of it. I'm curious, when Mahapajapati Gotama came to the Buddha, and when Ananda was talking to the Buddha and guilt tripped him, he said, or maybe I pointed out his family duty, an explanation that you didn't offer, which I'm curious about, like whether it might have any validity, is what if Ananda just got through to him? Like, what if the Buddha was delusional and Ananda got through to him about it? Like, is that a possibility that the Buddha was delusional about this? Like, anyone with male friends has been like, oh, buddy, you're really not seeing this. Let me help you out. And sometimes the guys are like, oh, you're right. I didn't see that, thank you.
That's a really funny question. I think it would depend how you're reading it. Are you reading it as literature or are you reading it as a devotee? Like, it depends what you are seeing in these texts, because as literature, sure, right? As a story, why not? But if you're viewing it from within the confines of the tradition, then you have a problem. Because if the Buddha is awakened and he needs Ananda to wake him up to the most basic reality that women deserve some kind of recognition, that's rough, right? So it depends what you want from the story. If you're just looking at it as a story, then sure.
I guess I want a practitioner's answer, not a literature answer. In the Zen tradition, which is the tradition I usually practice in, there's teachings about how we are awake within our condition, like we can awaken within our conditioning, and it's not like apart from or transcending conditioning, it's within it. So I guess I wonder whether that applied even to the Buddha. Maybe he is awake within his conditioning of misogyny.
Well, so this is like one of the most common readings of it, is that the Buddha was a person of his time, right? That he was a man of his time that did not understand women as having that kind of agency. and that's basically what's behind his rejection. Is not that he doesn't think women are allowed or are valuable. It's just that in his time and place, women would not have done this, right? And so he's being a man of his time. And then you could give that kind of reading. The problem, if you want to challenge that, is that we know that Jains did have nuns, and Jainism is a religion in India that's arriving at the same time, maybe even just a little bit before Buddhism. And the Jain community had instituted nuns. So the notion of a woman ascetic, of a woman renunciant, did exist in his time and place. Now, maybe he disagreed with it. Now he does, okay, there is one place where I can give this to you, is that, right? So Mahapajapati does something really cool, is she accepts the 8 rules, which I always see as her thinking, okay, if this is the only way I can manage the system, then I'll accept it, right? She gets ordained, but then the first thing she does in the Vinaya after she's ordained is she says to Ananda, could you see, it's always negotiated between Ananda and the Buddha, but she says, Ananda, go ask the Buddha if we could drop the first rule, which is amazing, right? And so like the first thing, so she's like, she waits to get ordained. She's like, okay, now I have the status. The second she has the status, she challenges the system, which is for me evidence that she knew exactly what her oppression was. And she understood how to navigate it given her condition, right? So she's a person navigating her conditions, right? And sees them. She's not blind, and there's no gaslighting that we can do to her. Oh, she didn't understand, or she was happy to accept it. No, she wants it gone. So she makes, that's the first request she makes. Ananda goes to see the Buddha, and he says, so Gotami asked me, it would be well, Lord, if we could get rid of this first rule of the Gaurudharmas. And the Buddha's answer is really interesting. He says, it would not be well if people of other communities saw the monks bowing to women. And so his answer is context specific, right? We cannot do it because we will lose credibility in our social reality if people see monks bowing to nuns. So the answer is no. Right? So there's your answer, is he's doing this because socially he cannot afford it, right? But if the Buddha himself cannot challenge the system, if the Buddha himself is going to uphold those kind of inequalities, whoever will ever have a chance of challenging them? And that's the counter argument to that, right? So you could say, oh, he's a man of his time and it was too hard for him. Sure, but he's the Buddha who flies through the sky. Every time he speaks, flowers fall from the heavens. He walks on a jeweled walkway from one end of the cosmos to the other, right? This is the one that the whole universe has been waiting for. Every time he speaks, the gods are like thundering applause, and he cannot challenge that one thing. That's the counter argument to your context answer, right? So it's like every answer we give, we go back to, like, it's just, we can't end the conversation in some ways, right? We're always going to hit, there's always another question to follow an answer, right? So yeah, I think on a reasonable level, you could say it was just too hard for that time and place. But then the Buddhist texts don't make him look like he finds things difficult. Wouldn't he have done this? Right? Or could he have done something like, women are capable, and so in private, when other people aren't looking, you bow to nuns properly, but if it's going to cost you socially, then adjust. Like, he doesn't make any, he doesn't put conditions to it. So I'm suspicious of that. And if a Buddha can't do it, who's going to be able to do it? Brian?
Thank you so much. This is just a fascinating discussion. I approach much of the reading that I've done from kind of the devotional side of things, and this is really the first time that I've heard such a frank discussion around the readings as history. My history is much more on from Christianity, and I oftentimes think of the Bible in that sense. But it's just been kind of an eye-opening process. It actually makes me think a little bit about the story of Job and kind of the severe difficulties that Job went through and kind of how that relates. But that's something that's
I feel like you just compared all of women to Job.
Yeah,
It's like a
exactly.
really shocking thing to hear.
It's like, yes. I'm just like, oh my
Oh,
goodness,
that's
like
awful.
how do we get how do I get my head around that?
That's
I,
terrible.
yeah, no, I mean, that's kind of that's what you're bringing forward for me. One question I have for you is, I'm just curious as to, do you have a practice? Do you have a devotional approach to Buddhism as well? I'm just curious. It's like, obviously this has been an area that is deeply, intellectually important to you, but I imagine, deeply personal to you as well. And so I'm kind of curious as to, how you approach these stories. Is there a devotional component, or is it mostly scholarly? And then thinking about how do you apply that to society? And well, I'll let you speak for yourself.
No, it's like a really hard question for me. I don't tend to answer those kind of questions. I used to answer questions like that, and I used to have answers to questions like that. There's a piece of me that is very devotional. I'm more of a devotional type than an intellectual type, to be honest, but it's really hard for me to. In all honesty, I find religions increasingly terrifying, to be truly honest. And so my capacity to engage with a tradition has gotten more difficult and more complicated over the years than where it was 30 years ago. Is that, and especially as the world is spinning kind of in a increasingly creepy way. And I see ethno-nationalism and fundamentalism growing in every pocket of the world, including the Buddhist world, including India, I mean, this is not just, Middle East or America or Putin. I mean, all of those included as well. Like, it's just, I'm increasingly uncomfortable, in all honesty. And so I love the stories and I hide in them, and I'm happy to live with them in like a bubble. But any kind of affiliation for me today is deeply painful as a concept.
I appreciate that. I appreciate that.
My honest answer.
Yeah.
It's hard to say.
Yeah.
Yeah, next. How do you say your name? Masiman?
Yeah, that's right. I'm sorry, I don't know the history well enough to know whether that first rule is still upheld, whether it was upheld, because what I wondered was, we're looking at it in a very well do it now kind of situation, but whether it was not the right time. I mean, I know you can't answer that, but one thing after another, but if he never revoked it, then that makes me
No, it's not revoked and it's still
curious.
practiced. So it depends on the community, right? So what you see is this constant negotiation. I mean, this is what all religions do, right? Is they're constantly negotiating themselves, right? And trying to adapt to the time and place that they live. So the way monks live in New York is not the same as the way monks live in Bangkok. It's different. So traditions are always having to renegotiate their rules, their stories to make sense of themselves where they live. The rules, the Garudharmas, the 8 rules, nuns in some traditions are still following them quite strictly. In other communities, they're just quietly forgotten, let's just pretend they're not there. There are some communities that have actually decided officially against them. So you have like a whole range of interpretations, but what you will find is that every community has to decide what they're going to do with them. So they're not gone. And in some communities, they're very alive, right? And it's not just for the nuns to figure out, it's for the monks to figure out. Because the nuns can say, we're not following this, but the monks decide, this is how we're going to interact, and they have all the power, right? So it's a community-wide negotiation that every community has to decide and figure out, and the responses change. I spent a summer in Sri Lanka interviewing nuns on this very, like, will you keep following them? Will you not keep following them? And I remember one nun saying to me, well, the Buddha instituted them because of his time and place, right? The eight, local time and place argument. And so I said, well, so if men and women become equal, then do we, like in a society, can we give them up? And she went, yeah, but that's never going to happen. Like she was just like, it'll never happen. So I don't know what you're talking about. The rules are here forever. So it's time and place, but everyone has to negotiate them, which means they're still really important.
Mm-hmm.
And that's part of why. So writing this book was harder for me than to write the Yasodhara book, because I was writing something that is current for so many Buddhist women. And I was very, very conscious of that. And that's why I met with different monastics to talk to them about it and to think it through and have them read it to see if it was kind of hitting a point that was appropriate for my readers. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Deanna?
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you so much for this. This is so rich and exciting. So my question is actually a bit more about your writing of the gathering and something specific to the book. I realize that's kind of a shift of gears. Is that okay?
Sure. Yeah, of course.
Okay, thank you. And maybe first, I'll just say that as an academic also, I so appreciate and support this idea of academics writing things that are written differently and more accessible, and an opportunity to play a little bit. And I think maybe it might have been in the introduction to the Yasodhara book. I really resonated with, you said something like, you said it more elegantly than this, something like, oh, I just lost my hand again. Let me re-raise it. Something like, I kind of asked myself, who was I to tell these stories? And then I kind of felt like, well, who am I to not tell the stories? And I so appreciate that. So anyway, one thing that I love about the gathering are these so colorful characters that are part of this 500 woman march that I'm familiar with from other suttas like Kisa Gotami, and to have them be like full colorful characters in their own rights. And so I'm just curious about, in your process, how did you sort of select who some of maybe these featured characters were going to be? How did you develop their stories and their characteristics to sort of really flesh them out?
That's a really good question. It's very different from academic writing, right? Because you're just, I'm like, who's my character going to be? Is not a question I ever thought about as a scholar, right? So I was like learning how to do this. So I learned it the first time with Yasodhara, and I just went straight to her voice. I made it first person. That was like the easiest way for me to do it. So I wanted it to be like, I wanted to challenge myself to learn a different style for this book. So each time I write something, I want it to be harder. I don't know why I do that to myself. So I decided third person, just to make it more complicated. And then I played around, I tried different voices, and I realized that the character could not be somebody that people feel devotional about, right? It was the same as, so when I wrote Yasodhara, most people I meet will be like, oh, I didn't know the Buddha had a wife. Like she's like so marginalized in the public imagination. She's not marginalized in literature, but she is marginalized in people's expectations of Buddhism, that I could take on her voice without kind of trampling on sacred ground in some ways. And when it came to this story, my first thought was to either continue with Yasodhara, but I was like, okay, no, been there, done that. Then the obvious answer was to do Mahapajapati. And the more I thought of taking on her voice, the more horrified I was, because I thought, no, this is a sacred person. She's like the female Buddha, right? So there's a very famous article that was a big part of my influence that you might know, Jonathan Walters. He wrote this great article where he talks about Mahapajapati as the female Buddha, that she is there to lead the women the way the Buddha is there to lead the men, and that she's like a parallel character in the Buddhist imagination. And I really held on to that reading of Mahapajapati that way. I thought, no, she is the female Buddha. She speaks for the women the way he speaks for men. She negotiates for them. She's the leader. She's the queen. She's the one. And setting her up that way, I couldn't take on her voice. She's too important. And I thought, then I would be doing something that I can't live with, right? And also because people have their own expectations of who she is, what she sounds like, right? Like I can't invade there. It's like taking on the Buddha's voice. I had a very hard time. I don't like writing in the Buddha. I do it very little, if you notice, because it freaks me out, right? So I had to choose characters that were marginal, but that I liked, you know, and that were problematic enough that they bugged me, right? So that was kind of I needed problem characters that were not too sacred. So Vimala, almost no one knows about her, and she has virtually no story, so she's like a blank canvas, and that's how I decided on her. So it was kind of, those are the kinds of decisions that you end up making that you would never think of making as a scholar. That's the fun part. If you're like, oh, I get to play here, who do I like? Which you don't, you know, so that was kind of how it goes. But it was definitely not to, I don't want it to go into sacred territory. So Patachara is as close as I got, and she's a little bit more on the side.
Thank you. I can hear like the energy and the fun as you
It's really
describe
fun.
it. So that's really awesome. So thank you.
I just, there's an article that's coming out in Tricycle next month that I wrote that I'm a little scared of. But they asked me to write like why, this question I keep getting of like, why do you choose to write this way instead of writing as a scholar? And so I wrote my answer to the question again of why I think scholars need to write more accessibly. So that's coming out in a month. I don't know if I'm going to get in trouble for saying a piece, but it is that it is a push that's partly political and partly playful of just, we got to get out of our box. I really think that.
Agreed.
I'm gonna
Totally.
get in
Thank you
trouble.
so much.
I'm so going to get into trouble.
Well, but those 500 women, you know, might have gotten into trouble
That's
too,
true.
but they
That's right.
pushed through, right?
That's right.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Barbara?
Well, first of all, I wanted to thank you for your scholarship and thank you for the history that you did present. And I know you talked a little bit about historical context and versus devotional context. And I'm a fairly new Buddhist practitioner, but most of my adult life has been through yogic traditions, both asana and other. And so these are just sort of my my ruminations that I've had over all these years of spiritual practice or being on my path, is that the historical context provides really important information for the resilience of the human spirit, and particularly women historically, who I think most people would agree we know very little about women's lives historically, especially in that time period at all. But we know sort of deep within ourselves that there was a system that was set up and everyone operated within that system for their safety. And I've often pondered this notion that there would be many more spiritual leaders or spiritual figures who were the gender women, had the patriarchal system not taken such a hold and set up a system where personal physical safety necessitated finding ways to live within these rules.
Mm-hmm.
And it has nothing to do with a physical gender of being female. It has to do with the situations that were set up in these cultures. And so that's where I feel like the devotional and the historical, you really can't pull them apart. I mean, they really are part of everything. But this realization that a spiritual path and a human, the ability of us as humans to connect with a spiritual path and a spiritual spark, we take into account, like you've been talking about, that the Buddha was living in this particular context. We take into account that he was a human being. He had an ego. I'm sure at some point this idea of this new religion that was very important and very compelling for people, and other religions that already existed, because we know, of course, there were, many, and and you brought up the Jane, but that there was a sense of, he's a human, and so he's going to respond in a human way, in addition to other ways that he was blessed with this ability to, to connect with his spiritual path and to pass it on. And so I feel like we can look at this information that you gave in so many ways, and I'm so appreciative of the details, because then I think we can weave them all into this deeper understanding of how women throughout history have figured out a way to negotiate our level of engagement, access, agency. And I think that's just a really big part of being able to continue a devotional path as a woman in this modern society, like just to really be able to connect with that. So I appreciate that. It causes me, it's always caused me great distress to see the certain religions have this complete absence of a female or a genderized female sensibility within them, because that was all part of the context of where it was evolving. And it's so important to be able to bring that out. So I appreciate your work with that.
Thank you. Mindy?
Maybe we should hold off on a few more questions for the moment. Maybe we can move the story forward. We've gotten to them being ordained. Maybe we can move forward with with the Terry Gata and some of the stories in the gathering, and then we can take more questions later on.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the story in some ways ends there and kind of starts there, right? Because the ordination has happened, and that's kind of the history of all of Buddhism now is going to open up to that. And you're going to have 2,000 or 2,500 years, wherever you want to place your starting point, of women following through and taking on ordination and building women monastic communities together. Each group is going to have to negotiate these rules and figure out how they're going to be in this Buddhist world. So in that sense, that's kind of the end of the story. There's one more little detail that has haunted me that is in the story that I put in the book. And I actually got criticized recently for not putting it in the Buddha's mouth, but I couldn't do it. There's a line in the Vinaya that after the women take ordination and they accept it, you get the 8 rules, and then it gets just a little bit worse. Even though you think you can't get much worse, there's just one more hit. And the hit is that the Buddha says, well, the community would have lasted 1,000 years, but now that women have come to the community, it's going to wither and die. It's going to lose half of its life. And then he says, because women are like mold on a rice field or rust on a chariot. It's really, really brutal. And this, again, is in the Buddha's, and this is in the Buddha's mouth. Like, the Buddha is described in the Vinaya as making this declaration. It's a devastating, that has haunted, like the day I came across that line in graduate school 25 years ago. I'm still not over it. I'm still upset about, I am Job, apparently, or mold on a rice field. Like, either way, there's no way to make this any better for myself. I am a disaster in the making. Brian, I'm never going to get over the Job reference. So in the book, I knew I had to put that line in, but here's the thing, is that this is where you know that there's a little bit of a devotional preacher inside of me. I couldn't make the Buddha say it. It was just too far for me. I was just, if I make the Buddha say that, I don't know, it's like I tanked the book or something. I couldn't do it. And so I make this, like, there's a monk in the Buddhist literature who refuses to teach the nuns, and he gets scolded by the Buddha, right? Because one of the rules is monks have to teach nuns, and he doesn't want to. So I've always decided this guy's like a horrible, horrible monk. What kind of guy is like, I won't even talk to them? That's how bad he is. And so then he gets scolded. So I'm like, that's the one. So I grabbed that monk and I made him say, women are like mold on a rice field. In my notes at the end of the book, I explain he's not really the one who says this. I've just like put the blame on him. It's actually the Buddha's line, but I couldn't do it. Right. And so the story like devolves even further. And Buddhism is going to have to wrestle with this misogyny all its history. Like it never goes, like there's like little, it creeps into the tradition over and over again. It never quite goes away. And it sometimes flares up. And so this is something that I think Buddhists have to wrestle with. And in some ways, Ava asked that question at the beginning of like, how do I live with this story? How do I live with these horrible realities that I'm starting to face as I read this literature? My answer is you just have to face it. I don't have any kind of like, deep teaching that like some, monk is going to give you. All I have is the tradition is really messy and it's really hard. And it's so much harder than I think we're prepared for, especially when you have a strong convert community and you go into it with like wide eyes of like, help me, which is how most of us go into Buddhism at first. And we hope that it's going to solve all our problems. And then we go in and we find all of our problems are there too. You're not going to solve them by becoming a Buddhist or by joining this community versus that community, because every community is messy. And every community has its misogyny and its racism and its shortcomings and its contradictions, and Buddhism is included. And so in some ways, my answer to her question at the beginning is, I can't make it better. I can only tell you it's true. And that's part of the practice, is you're going to have to sit in the muck, and the muck is Buddhist. It's not everybody else is great. And, everybody else is mucky and Buddhism is some clean lotus flower floating around. The muck is Buddhist. And that's the only way I know how to be with this literature, is to accept that everything that is humanly produced is messy. And if we're going to be honest, then we are demanded to deal with it. That's like the only answer I've got really to this. I don't know if that's helpful or that makes things worse, but I do think that's all I know how to do, is sit with it and go, okay, the Buddha is not quite always who I thought he was. Yeah. I didn't answer your question about the Therigatha, but I can get to that, or if anybody wants to respond to that, and then I can talk about the Therigatha. Ava, does that respond? Where did she go? I lost her. She was on my screen. Oh, there you are. Now I see you. Ava, does that kind of respond to you, or I haven't made anything better for you?
Vanessa, your books and meeting you finally in person, and as in person as it gets, it's a real gift. When I first encountered Buddhism, the idea was that Buddha said, never believe something, come here and examine it for yourself. But after a few years of examining and seeing how much it actually works, then started it becoming a devotion, until I read your book and I realized, wait, I have to go back to come and examine. And that's such a gift to me. Thank you. Thank you. Because I was naturally going toward, now I accept everything. Whereas now I'm back to, let's actually check this out for this one being and see if it works for me or not.
I think that's so good. And I think that's what we're supposed to do. And I think any tradition, any person with integrity has to keep doing that work, right? It's not just a Buddhist practice. It's a human practice of take your world seriously and examine it, because it's very easy to get glassy-eyed, right? And I see this in Buddhism. I see it in like born again Christians, anybody who like, we're very quick to just be like, oh, I found the truth. Everything's better now. And that's a safe space to go. And it does make us feel better, but you can't stay there. Everything is messy, right? So unless you've achieved awakening, and I have no idea what that's like. It's messy and it's hard. And all the mess of the world is right here in it. And it's right there in the Buddhist stories. It's there in Buddhist monasteries. It's in Buddhist. I mean, if it wasn't, we wouldn't have sex scandals left, right, and center in every Buddhist community. Like we know now in ways that we didn't know 20 years ago, that the mess is at our door, right? We cannot pretend that just because something's Buddhist, it's going to be okay, right? That's really irresponsible. So we have to expect that that's going to be true in the text as well. Right? Everything is hard. Everything is messy. That's the first Buddhist truth. Everything is suffering, including Buddhism. And so we have to wrestle with that and face it and go, okay, what do I do with this? Instead of, oh, everything's okay. Nothing's okay. That's the whole point of samsara. Nothing's okay. Sounds really depressing. But I don't know. I find it liberating. It makes me giggle instead of, I get depressed when everything seems to be set. then I get nervous. Masiman?
Sorry, I know you wanted to move on. I just wanted to go back to the historical context, to
Yeah.
the wider historical context, because I don't know whether it's different in the other Brahmanical religions, but certainly in Hinduism, there are so many female monks, not monks, female
Renunciants.
goddesses and divine, and divine mother. Was that prevalent at the time that the Buddha we're talking about?
That's a really good question. So Buddhism is coming up just as the Upanishads are coming up. The beginnings of the Mahabharata and the Ramayana are just starting, and they're just starting in oral tradition, so they're not fixed. So the Ramayana and the Mahabharata and some of the Puranas are actually getting written down at the same time that our earliest Buddhist narratives are getting written down. So they're all like 600 years or 500 years later, right? So it depends how you do, like these timelines are really hard to pin down. But if you put the Buddha about 2,500 years ago, and you do the first biographies of him about 2,000 years ago, you also have the Mahabharata and the Ramayana about 2,000 years ago, but we think their oral traditions were floating around for about 400 or 500 years before. So all of these stories are coming up together. What different, like, we don't know who knew what, right? Like, we can't pin any of this down, but I think it makes sense to assume that those stories were floating around the Buddha. So that's why I do that. So in my writing, I put like references to the Ramayana in there all the time, and I make references to Durga and to Shiva and to Vishnu, just because it seems obvious to me that he would have heard those stories and would have been part of that storytelling world. And I think that's appropriate historically, but we can't prove it, right? Because we don't have any of the texts until later. The strengthening of some of those female characters, that's a curious question, and it's hard to know. So the concept of Devi and Shakti, this comes up later. Did we have an oral tradition that was already strong around his time? We don't know. We have lots of yakshis and apsaras and all of that are floating around him, but they're not like individually strong characters. We did have Hariti. I don't know if you know anything about Hariti. So we have a couple of carvings of Hariti around like our earliest Buddhist period. She's a character, she's not in the Indian literature, but she is a strong female character that the Buddhists seem to have imagined, concocted. She's like a demoness that gets converted and turns into good. And she's like a really strong figure of the Buddhist imagination in the early period, but it's hard to know. I think it's all starting to bubble,
I was thinking not just of the divine feminine, but I was thinking more of female saints.
They come later. Yeah.
They come later.
They come later. So that's why I was making reference to, like, you have Sita and Draupadi, who would have been like a female kind of figure that, so that's all coming up at the same time.
Right.
I think it's reasonable that the stories are bumping into each other, but we can't prove it, right? Because it's all just starting to happen. So I've put them in the books and I write in my endnotes. I can't prove that this would have been the case, but I think it's reasonable to have the stories emerge together.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. Mindy?
I became familiar with this story that you told today after I became involved with the nuns who are out in California, probably about 15 years ago. And before I became involved, I had been meditating probably for close to 20 years, but really had not heard this story at all.
Wow.
And I meditated with a lot of monastics in monastic communities, male monastics, and had never really heard anything about the women's community. And when I started looking into it, historically, I understood that the women's community or the women monastics kind of dropped out of existence for about 1500 years. Later down the road, they dropped out of existence and were really not registered. And there were a lot of the male monastics who were in charge felt that they could not be,
reinstated.
it couldn't be jump-started again because of a lot of various reasons. I don't know if you go into that part of history in the book, but
No,
but how it impacts practice today is really interesting to me, because there wasn't a female presence for so many years. And in the earlier part of the century, it was just so challenging for women to become ordained for all of these reasons. And so I think the original story, just like the original teachings, are really important. But what happened down the road, I think, is really important as well. So I just wanted to bring that up.
Yeah, no, I think you're really right. And I think what happens in the stories informs so much of what happens down the road, right? So I don't think they're separate boxes. Different communities did different things with ordination of women. So in what you're talking about is Theravada tradition. So are you talking about the Dhammadharini monastic community?
Saranaloka, the Aloka Vihara.
Right. So this is Theravadan.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in the Theravada tradition, the tradition says that the lineage died out all over the Theravadan world around somewhere between the 11th and the 13th century. This hasn't been properly historically navigated, so we're still not completely sure that this is completely true, but it seems to have certainly faded into almost disappearance. Women, if they wanted to practice, they had to just kind of do it individually or unofficially, but they couldn't do it as part of a monastic community because the lineage died. So lineage is really, really important all over the Buddhist world, except in the West often, right? Is this idea that who you get your teaching, like if I want to be ordained, I have to be ordained by a group of monks and nuns who they were ordained by a group of monks and nuns who they were ordained, that has to go all the way back to the Buddha. And so that lineage has to be unbroken for it to be official. So lineage is almost like a tangible material thing. It's like a thread that goes from the Buddha generation to generation to generation to me. If the thread breaks, the argument becomes, well, we need a Buddha to start the thread again. So
or an ordained nun.
Sorry?
Or an ordained nun.
Right, but the thread broke, so you can't, right? So if the thread breaks and there's no more nuns for a generation, you can't start it up again because the nuns had to have been ordained by previous nuns, by previous nuns, by previous nuns to the Buddha himself. So in Theravada tradition, when the nuns disappeared, but the monks continued, which incidentally, what we think may have happened is that it was because of royal favor that it was stopped giving to the nuns because they were of less importance. They kept supporting the monks. The nuns disappeared. And then when women said, I want to become a nun, you can't, because it doesn't exist anymore. And so what happens in Theravadan communities is many communities have been told and maintain this, that you have to live as an unofficial nun without any status. You can practice it, but you'll never be a real nun, which means you can't create karmic merit and you can't support yourself, basically. It's more complicated, but I won't go too much into the details until the next Buddha shows up. So we have to wait patiently for another Buddha to arise. Then he will start the nuns' tradition again. And then we have the thread, and then you can be ordained. So in Theravadan tradition, it got really murky really fast. And so you have communities that don't even think they can be nuns. And then the new women who do become nuns feel it imperative that they follow the rules very, very strictly, including the Garudamas, because they're already breaking the rules by choosing to be nuns when they're not even allowed to be nuns. So it's very complicated in that community. You have in Himalayan traditions, so Bhutanese, Nepalese, Tibetan traditions, Ladakh, you never even started the nuns' ordination. So in Himalayan traditions, the nuns were never there. There were never any Buddhist nuns. It doesn't exist, right? So all the Tibetan Buddhist nuns that you've seen, historically, they're not fully ordained. So they're living as nuns, but they don't have the status. So this is something that women have been challenging over the last 30 years to try to recreate. It's a big, complicated thing. And so some women have taken on ordination for themselves, but it's not recognized, right? I mean, it's more, I'm being very quick, but it's officially not recognized. The women have asked and begged the Dalai Lama to please consider challenging this system and giving Tibetan women ordination. He refuses to get involved. He has not done it. And then last year, for the first time in Himalayan history, the king of Bhutan said, to hell with it, we're doing it anyway. Him and the chief abbot of Bhutan together concocted a way legally, which again is its own complicated legal reality, but they legally created a way for nuns to be ordained in Bhutan for the first time in history. 143 women were ordained by the king. Well, he sponsored the event, and the abbot of Bhutan officiated, and they were ordained. It is the first time that we have Himalayan women ordained in a Himalayan tradition in history. So this stuff is really, really current. These stories affect how we understand women, their desire to ordain, their desire to live a life of renunciation, to be recognized as women who are living a renunciant life. It is coloring, so these stories are alive. And so if you have a Buddha being reticent to give women ordination, you can see how it trickles all the way to the 21st century of all these other ways in which the communities can be reticent to support women who want to live a life of renunciation. So this really does matter. These stories matter. They have political impact, they have social impact, they're emotional stories. And it's I think we have to know about this. We have to know a little bit more about what goes on in the Buddhist world and how Buddhists are navigating their experience with these texts. I think that's a way for us to look outward a bit more. Yeah, Mindy.
I think it's important to just include the workaround in the Theravada tradition of the Chinese ordination and how that was
Right.
brought.
So I was being very, very quick. There's a lot
Yeah.
to be said about it. I didn't want to like overly complicate it.
I know, but just to say
Yes.
that there are a lot there are a lot of communities that feel like it is legal and it has been done appropriately,
Of
and
course.
and that there is full ordination for women in the Theravada tradition, and that started about 30 years ago.
That's all the Sakyadhita work and
Yeah.
really important work that's been done. The women have been spearheading it and trying to find ways to legally challenge this status quo. So they're doing it. But it's like we're at the 21st century, and we just had our first ordination of women in Himalayan tradition last year. So when I finished with this book, I wanted to launch it. I mean, obviously I was going to launch it, but I kept thinking, what's the appropriate venue to launch this book? And I thought it has to be with the nuns. My book is for them. It's their story. And so that's the first public place that I would share the book. And so Sakyadhita is an organization that has been supporting nuns since like the 1980s to fight for ordination, to fight for equal rights. It's this amazing international organization run by women for women to figure out how to be in this world with these complicated rules and limitations. And so I wrote to the organizers and I said, I wrote this book and I want to launch it with you. Can we set that up? And they said yes. And the meeting was in Korea. So that was this past summer, like 8 months ago, last June in Korea. And so I got to Korea, and nobody runs a meeting like the Koreans. It was the most amazing thing I have ever seen. I mean, wow, I've done these meetings in other countries and never looked like this. This was 5,000. Nobody knows. Everybody disagrees. It's just like Buddhist text. Everyone you speak to gives you a different number. So I've heard everything from 3,000 to 5,000. Somebody even said 10, but I know that wasn't true. And like people publish these numbers, just like Buddhist texts, right? So I just saw someone else who published 5,000. I was like, was it 5,000 though? I don't know. It's just so typically Buddhist. It gets better every time you tell the story. But whatever the story was, I don't know how many people were in it. It was a stadium of Buddhist nuns. Like I have never seen anything like it. When I did this meeting in Indonesia, it was like 200 people under a tent. Like it was like, we were eating and like, the whole time while people were talking on the stage. It was just this like community big tent event. This was a Korean stadium. Never seen it. Super organized. It had like, they put videos, they had like strobe lights going, like it was like a K-pop show. Amazing. And so they had this huge room full of monastic women from all over the world. And I was on stage with the group of women from Bhutan. And so what we set it up as is that the 3 women from Bhutan presented first. And so I was there with them, but they presented and they talked about what it felt like to be the first women to ordain in Himalayan history. And they told the story. And it was amazing to listen to those women tell the story of finally breaking that bloody ceiling, right? Like they finally did it. And one of the women said, and I'll never forget this, she said, if it looked like she said it looked like a miracle, like everything went so well, and like a rainbow popped out of the sky at the right moment. So classically Buddhist, rainbows have to fly everywhere. So rainbow popped out and everything worked well and everybody was so happy. And she said it looked like a miracle, but let me tell you, it wasn't. That was no miracle, right? That was decades of pushing to get through the door. And she talked about all the hate mail she got and that she didn't open one letter, one email. She just said, when it's finished, then she'll open it, right? Like, I mean, the courage that these women had to finally get through, and that they got hate mail, right? Like, I never even asked her. I should have asked her if she actually ever read it afterwards, but she didn't say. But she, like, they went through to the other side. And so the stadium full of Buddhist nuns, all listened to this fantastic story. And then once they were done, there was something else. And then there was me and this, like, a colleague of mine who interviewed me and asked me questions about the book that I wrote. And it was just the wildest thing that I've ever experienced. I think everybody in the room realized how wild the moment was. You could hear a pin drop in that stadium. And it was just wild because here I was telling them the story that they just lived. So I was like, I'm writing the story that's 2,000 years old after hearing how it just went, like how it just happened 5 minutes ago. And so it was a very emotional, it was the most extraordinary event. I thought, I'm never going to have an experience like this again in my life, to be able to share my writing with the people I wrote it for in a situation like this, where the thing that I was dreaming of just happened in real life. It was the wildest experience, but it really put the finger on, wow, we have been fighting for this for 2,500 years. 2,500 years ago, women saw that glass ceiling and they said, can I get through? So it's not like, the first time women realized they were oppressed was when they burned their bras in the 60s. This has been going on for 2,500 years. Sorry, I'm getting emotional. So, but it's intense. It's really quite something to think it out like that. I will stop. I never talked about the Therigatha. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
You should all read the Therigatha.
Yeah, I feel like we just scratched the surface, but I think that's a pretty good place to leave it there with that thought.
Thank you. I think so
Yeah.
too.
Yeah. Well,